part of FATES? Is there something that you can add? Is there something? Let us know. Contact us. Make your voice heard on how you want to move things forward. That's how things happen. Community voice, community involvement. So the goal is for FATES to be the primary vegetation model. As a reminder, the standard CLM is a big leaf model. So you have pools of vegetation separated up onto a grid cell by percentages for different vegetation types. They don't interact, they don't mix. And so there's not a strong connection with reality or with observations. FATES is a cohort model, so you have mixes of different types of vegetation, different sizes, and then on a grid cell you have different times sense disturbance. And so you can end up with different mixes based on what's going on with mortality for those different types of vegetation. This is important to address questions like timber yields, wildfire risk, and ecosystem vulnerability, all of which are directly connected to size structure and specific PFTs. What if you're not ready for that level of complexity? We've thought about you. We have different complexity modes. Satellite phenology, you're using observations to set the LAI. You don't have any disturbance, there's no growth, and there's no mortality. You can also run without competition. And so with this, I think of it as pretty similar to the big leaf model. So you have PFTs separated, but you get size structure. You can also have prescribed biogeography, where you're telling the model what the range of this vegetation is, but then you add in competition. And so these PFTs are trying to outwin one another. And then you can have full FATES where everyone lives or dies based on whatever's going on. Full complexity. We have a lot of priorities and things that we're working on. It's a big list. Each of these can be its own project or multiple projects within each of these boxes. Land use, land cover change, we're going to have a targeted meeting after this meeting, and then another follow-up meeting about data. It's a very small group of people. We're looking at dynamic land units and actually using the land use harmonization data that Peter talked about yesterday within FATES. Nutrients, implementing those connections. Okay, the microphone changed, but that's okay. Implementing those connections within CLM. You're going to hear about nutrients today. Fire is functional. It's undergoing testing. We just need to add the connection for fire emissions to go to the atmosphere. Megan, dry deposition, work in FATES SP. Calibration, there are a number of calibration activities. You'll hear about some of those today. FATES SP is fully functional. It's undergoing calibration and testing. We have a number of infrastructure projects in there. And so today, you're going to hear talks from individuals about a lot of these pieces. So there's a lot already happening within FATES. Is it enough? No. Join us. And then what else do you want to happen? What else is important? Keep talking to us. ILAM testing, Adriana Foster, yesterday, gave us hot off the presses some ILAM results for different versions of FATES. And so if you look on the right, we have FATES SP, we have no competition, and then we have fixed biogeography. And we have the difference between an old parameter file and a new parameter file that Jennifer Holm provided some updates for. And I think they were targeted on specific regions. But you could see the biomass benchmark map here on the left, and then above that is the model mean for the new parameters, and below that is the model mean for the old parameters. And so you can see that the new parameters look much better. And if you look at the ILAM score, this dark purple indicates that it's doing the best for biomass. There's a lot of information in ILAM, and we haven't really had a chance to go through it all. If we look at GPP, what we see, not surprisingly, is that FATES SP, which is being fed data, outperforms the other pieces. And so like I said, we haven't really dug into this, but we're able to test this within the ILAM framework, and we're looking at some early results. And so it's an iterative process as we move along. Within this calibration, we're looking at using these complexity modes to allow us to target specific parameters. Because you can turn things on and off, growth and disturbance, competition, it allows you to target allometry or carbon allocation, and then you can take it to full complexity where you're then looking at competition. Adriana has also completed a mini PPE on FATES-SP to allow us to target specific variables, look at their variability on an annual basis, as well as interannual variability. And I don't have time to talk about all the amazing things. Adriana has also been looking at some single-point neon simulations. So using some Bayesian statistical methods to calibrate parameters, using LiDAR data, images shown on the right top, to provide initialization data for neon sites, and then comparing it to observations. And so at the bottom, you have observations, comparison between GPP observations shown in red, and then the FATES is in blue. But it looks so good that you can't even see it because it's right behind the observations. So this is great news. Adriana has also updated the create new case script so that you too can more easily go in and run the neon sites. What it does is it just creates a whole bunch of, updates the user NL files with the specific variables that you need to run at the neon sites. And so it works at 45 neon sites. It doesn't work at the crop locations. Check it out, run it. There are not initial conditions, but you can certainly generate those yourself. I've been looking at fire at a regional scale. And so these are comparisons. I've been looking specifically at the impact of fuel drying on the interaction between climate, fire, and vegetation. And so we have a high fuel drying scenario, biomass accumulation on the top left, and then a low fuel drying scenario below that. And then the figures to the right are the difference between those. And so when you have higher fuel drying, you get warmer temperatures, you have lower humidity, and a loss of biomass. Not surprisingly, you can see the loss of biomass. With this transition in vegetation, you also get a transition in vegetation type, but with these transitions, you get an increase in burn fraction, increase in fire intensity, and an increase in the rate of spread. And those increases, if we look at this across all of the tropics, those areas where we have biomass on the top left, the distribution of C4 grasses below that, burn fraction on the right, and then fire intensity below that. The areas where we have the highest fire intensities, shown in these darker colors, are areas where grasses persist. And so this shift in biogeography, when you shift towards grasses, you're going to have increased fire behavior. I don't have a detail of it, but you can see that there's a lot of burning going on in the burn fraction. And if you know the burned area product, this is a lot of burning. But if you look at the fire intensity below that, these fires that are happening within the Amazon, within these areas where we still have high biomass, are low intensity. And so they're below 150 kilowatts per meter, which is characteristic of understory fires within the Amazon that do not cause a large amount of mortality, which means we're within the realm of reality, but the model is tracking all fires, even these low intensity fires. So there's a lot to do there, but the drying of the fuels is important. These simulations do not include land use, land cover change, which we need that to talk about reality. And I just want to come back to the importance of climate, fire, vegetation interactions. Right now, they're having really severe fires in Chile. So this is a map of South America on February 2nd. And then if you follow it down to the right, you can see the red dots are active fires. And then this colorful plume is the aerosol index associated with pyrocumulonimbus activity. And so when you have a very intense fire, it can actually loft the smoke into the stratosphere. And I don't think about pyroQBs very much, but you can track that, and that's going to be lofted and transported globally. The fires, the Black Summer within Australia 2 years ago, or maybe it's longer than that, also had a lot of these convective events. These are common, but this is a process that we don't fully understand in reality, and it's also not fully integrated into these types of models. But it's an essential connection between fires and the atmosphere, and the way that you get these high-intensity fires is because of the fuels that you have on the ground. So we need to make sure we get all of the pieces right. And with that, I want to bring you back to FATES. We have really great technical documentation. It's all publicly on GitHub. There's a user guide, which is now searchable. And then we have tutorial materials from 2022. We're looking to update those, so keep an eye out for that. FATES also has a discussion board. So if you have a question, how do I do this? I'm thinking about this, or hey, wouldn't it be really great if we did this really cool thing like pyroQBs? How could we do that? We have a discussion board where you can post that. If there's a problem, we have issues. And then it's all publicly available, and you can track it, follow the conversation, be a part of the conversation. And with that, I want to acknowledge the DOE and NG Tropics, and I have like 2 minutes for questions. Okay.
She will. Well, go.
Online.
Adriana said that this is, I think, in reference to the ILAM results, that biomass is not really output on the SP mode.
She here?
No. Just want to be sure.
Adriana is, yeah.
Okay. The FATES, okay, so the biomass in the SP results on ILAM are kind of junk because FATES SP doesn't actually do biomass.
Okay, so if we went back to the ILAM.
And folks that are in the chat, she also provided links to the ILAM results if you want to dig in.
Great.
I had a question about the ILAM results. It seems like for the SP, in contrast to the FATES versions where you allow for competition or changing biogeography, there's no change between the old parameters and the new parameters. So does that mean that the satellite phenology is overprinting any changes that you can possibly make to the parameters? Like that, that's the PC1 of what's happening when you run it in SP mode is whatever input you're giving it, rather than what's happening internal to the model?
I would have to get into it. If we look at the actual numbers here, there's like a teeny tiny difference.
Oh, okay, I didn't see the numbers. Okay.
But yeah, I would have to get in there.
It looks like from the list of parameters that are up there that a lot of those might not make a difference, but you certainly are parameters that would be different.
Yeah, that's a great point.
You're talking about like there might be variables that look different, or there's like multiple parameter sets.
Well, I just mean some of those parameters would not make a difference between an SP mode and others would. I don't know.
Oh, okay, sorry. I spent so much time looking at the ILAM figure. There's a lot on this slide. All right.
As a note about
But
that.
Ryan probably knows. I don't actually know which ones, but Ryan would know.
Yeah, so the list of parameters that we mentioned up there is correct, but it's also not for all 12 of our PFTs. It's actually for a subset of like 3.
Yeah.
So this is kind of more of a proof of concept. I don't expect to see much difference.
I mean, it's a proof of concept, but it's a proof of concept that's working.
Yeah,
So, I mean,
yeah.
it was an improvement, but whether or not this is going to improve the SP to be determined. All right, I need to escape out of this. I'm going to pass it over to our expert in the booth.
I can do this part.
Yeah, our next talk is going to be online from Marcus Longo. Marcos will be ready in just a moment.
You should be able to hear now.
Oh, can you hear us?
Yes, Marcos, we can hear you. And
Okay, I can share my screen here if it's okay.
Nick, is it okay if he shares his screen? It's fine with me. Okay,
Uh,
they're saying yes. Go ahead.
I think it's.
Right, well, good morning, everyone. So I'm Michael Zongo. I'm from Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, and what I'm going to show is some ongoing work on trying to use data to generate and represent multiple plant functional types across the wet and dry tropics with fates. And before I start, I just would like to give big thanks to many people who have contributed either with the model development, data, ideas, and also to Energy Tropics, who has funded the work. And just to give a brief motivation of the work that we're doing is, as the climate is changing, we know that higher temperatures and combined in some places with reduction in precipitation will lead to a significant intensification of droughts in the tropics, most notably in the neotropics, where you can see this intensification. And the question is how the forest is going to respond to these changes in climate. So plants do have very different strategies on how to resist or be resilient to droughts, and one of them is actually deciduousness. And there is some limited evidence that in some places there is already a response to increased intensification. This is a network of plots in southern Ghana where there is a strong gradient in precipitation from the south to north. And what the people monitoring these plots over the past few decades have noticed is that in the driest sites, there is a significant increase in the dominance of drought deciduousness. So, and which highlights the relevance of considering those different strategies in the tropics for a proper representation. So, with this in mind, the goals of the research that we've been doing is one to first finish implementing a drought deciduous phenology in fates. Also, going beyond just like drought deciduous versus evergreen, it's actually, we know that those tropical forests are super diverse, and with more data available nowadays, we can actually try to expand this beyond just the deciduous versus evergreen dichotomy and try to have different plant functional types based on the data, and then assess whether or not with this implementation we are able to get coexistence of different combination of PFTs across the precipitation gradient. So just a very quick overview of how fates handles drought deciduousness. So it's somewhat linked to also what happens in CLM, for example, in which you have a water stress function. Although we do have a few differences in this case. First of all, it is dependent on the PFT. And what we do is we calculate a running average of the soil metric potential within the rooting zone, but taking into account the fact that roots may have different abundance across the different soil thickness layers, and also that different PFTs may have different rooting depth. So we calculate this index, and what we do is use this as a comparison with a critical threshold to define which drought deciduous phase the plants are going to be, whether in leaf abscission, when the metric potential is less than the critical threshold and there is no recent flushing, so we just to avoid like plants to flush and abscise leaves all the time, and or if it's been a very long time since they abscise the leaves. And leaf flushing will happen when they go above this critical threshold, implying that the moisture conditions are improving, or if they haven't flushed the leaves for a very long time, in which case they will give a try and hope for the best. And there are a few additional important things that we implemented. One is that a very different way in which carbon is allocated depending on the phenological phase. So when leaves are abscised, plants enter in a carbon storage saving mode in which they try to retain maintain the tissues as little as possible. And with this, we also implemented fine root deciduousness, meaning that the model can actively abscise the fine roots as well as the leaves, as a test hypothesis testing, because this is highly uncertain. And the other thing is that we implemented an option for semi-deciduous phenology, although I'm not going to talk about this and I'll explain that in a second, why not. So for the definition of PFTs, what we did was to actually gather traits data from multiple data sets, most notably the TRI database and also the Angiotropics archive, which has lots of data, but also other data from the literature and also allometric data. But for the traits definition, what we did was for every trait that we were able to get, and we were able to get traits for over 4,000 species in the neotropics and many traits for over 200 species, a few over 3,000 species. What we did was to normalize the traits based on the distribution, run a cluster analysis using all the numeric and categorical data that were available to us, and using gap statistics to tell what was the optimal number of PFTs. And then once we defined those PFTs based on the clusters, we looked at the distribution of these PFTs to try to differentiate the trait values for the PFT implementation fates, and also look at the trade-off between the different traits to help setting more parameters in fates. Just to highlight that even though we had quite a lot of data, the data is not evenly distributed across the neotropics. You can see even with SLA, which is relatively abundant in terms of the measurements. A lot of the data are coming from a few sites like Barracu and Barra Colorado, and some sites in Brazil, but like not evenly distributed. In other traits like VC Max, we have almost nothing. So it's really a challenge, even though we are trying to get as much data as we're able to get. So it's still quite a lot of gaps. With this in mind, we run the cluster analysis, and with the unsupervised approach that tells us the optimal number of gaps, clustering gaps, we are able to identify 4 plant functional types. 3 of them were dominated by evergreen species, 1 of them by drought deciduous, and almost nothing was available for semi-deciduous, which is why we kind of set that aside for now. For the evergreen, we noticed that there was a strong axis across the acquisition and survivorship gradient, so like wood density versus SLA, kind of almost anti-parallel here with lots of nutrients, and that was the main separation of these PFTs, and the drought deciduous was just 1 cluster that had drought deciduous. And here, just to highlight some of the differences in the distribution, I'm just plotting the density functions for a couple of traits, and you can see that there is a clear separation in the distribution of specifically aerial or carbon-nitrogen ratio between the early successional trees. And for the drought deciduous, they tend to be a bit more similar to early successional, which makes sense because those plants have a short growing season. So they have to be highly productive during this short growing season to make the enough carbon. Also, we analyzed the trade-offs and we tried to separate by different PFTs. And the maximum that we're able to get for a few of them is a separation between evergreen and deciduous. But for most of them, we had so few data points like carboxylation rate versus wood density that we're only able to establish a universal single trade-off relationship. With this, we implemented the traits based on the expected values on each of the clusters, and we decided to give a try with the model just to see version 0 how it works. And so bear with me that this is like kind of like first iterations of this analysis, but there are some encouraging results and some challenges here. So what I'm plotting here is near background conditions for 3 sites in South America. This is a very wet site in the Amazon, a transitional site in the middle one in the southern part of the Amazon, and a dry forest site that is kind of like semi-arid location. So what we see is that the equilibrium steady-state biomass is actually very close to observations at the 3 sites. So that was a like encouraging thing. And in the case of the dry forest, we are actually able to get coexistence with dominance of drought deciduous, which is also encouraging. The challenge is the fact that the evergreens, we weren't able still to have a coexistence. So early successional tended to dominate all over where drought deciduous were located. In terms of the size class, again, like the leaf area index, which tends to be a bit low in fates, but nevertheless, we do see a distribution of the, so here it's just like the total LAI divided by the size classes. And you see that the wet forests tend to have much higher dominance of large trees compared to the dry forest sites, which is actually also consistent with observations. Although that said, we do have a bit too many of those large trees in the very wet forests. So there are a few things still to figure out. Just 2 seconds here. We is also trying to explore the way that the model represents fluxes and the leaf area index here in the case in the bottom row compared to MODIS, and ET and GPP compared with the local weather covariance towers. And we see that there is a tendency of the model to have low evapotranspiration and low GPP at the very wet forests, partly because maybe too much albedo is happening, but this seasonality is actually not bad. For the dry site, we do have a strong seasonality as observed, although in terms of the timing, the drought deciduous tend to shed their leaves a bit too late still. So there is still some work to be done in terms of parameter optimization, but I think the results are showing are quite encouraging. I think I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to go quite quickly here. Just wanted to highlight one thing that was important in the dry forest site, is that the carbon allocation strategy was critical to get the coexistence right. So what happens in the sites is that we have the multi-year drought, and when you look at the allocation between the early successional evergreen and the drought deciduous, we have a lot of allocation to leaves, even during the dry season. That leads to very consistent, strong negative carbon balance in the model, which you see here, the dark green in the bottom. Whereas the drought deciduous, there is a very brief, very negative value, but that's at the beginning of the wet season when they are able to recover from these losses. So they're able to survive much better in this case. So just to wrap up here, I think we are able to show that the fates can represent coexistence to a certain extent. There is still some work to be done, and that's a combination also on the lack of data and have a better separation of the PFTs. But our next step is actually to run a optimization of the parameters based on the distributions that we found, and also based on multiple processes, because that's an important thing to try to get the distribution across the sites right, and then eventually work on see how the climate change can affect the distribution of the phenology strategies across the tropics. And with this, I'd like to thank you.
Thanks, Marcos. That was great. We have 2 minutes for questions. I've got a question here in the room. Abby?
Yeah, hi Marcos. Thanks. That's very cool to see that using data to sort of without making prior assumptions about the PFTs, but I noticed that they don't look terribly different, at least at the big scale from what might have been there before. Can you tell me like what surprised you, or like, yeah, what is different or what is similar to sort of how we had PFTs set up before you went and queried all of the data?
Sorry, so just to see if I understood, because it's a bit low here. So you're asking what were the traits that were quite different versus quite similar when I defined the PFTs, is that?
Yeah, they look like the broad categories look similar to maybe what would have been in Fates previously. So yeah, what's new or what is like confirmed about what we were doing before?
So I mean, none of the traits were outrageously different. From the previous assumptions, but like what we witnessed kind of tried to separate was really like to get different points within more or less the same range. I can actually show very quickly here. I have 1 more minute just to show some of the So for example, like wood density, we did see a separation between the early, mid, and late successional. Same thing with the specific leaf area, which were quite different. So there were some differences in between the different classes that we are able to observe. But clearly, there must be some stronger trade-offs, I would say, that are currently not fully represented in the model. Otherwise, we should be able to get the early versus late coexistence, for example. So it's still work in progress, but we are able to identify at least some significant differences between some of the traits.
Thanks, Marcos.
I don't know if I answered that question, Abby.
That was great. That was great. And I mean, this is really brings it back to the data. And, now we can really look at competition. And Marcos is looking at a new strategy, drought deciduousness, as well as across the precipitation gradient. And so, thank you, Marcos, that was awesome. And we'll switch over to Jesse Needham. And apologies, Jesse, I don't have the name of your talk here, but Jesse is going to be talking about some calibration work that she's been doing globally. Jesse is also remote, so go ahead and, okay, we can see your presentation, but it's not in slideshow. Okay,
That look good?
looks good, we can hear you.
Great. Thanks, Jackie. Okay, so today I'm presenting on global calibration of fates. So this is obviously a huge effort, so just want to acknowledge everyone listed here and everyone that's involved in fates development. Okay, so one of the things I've been doing is trying to gather data sets of forest inventory data that we can use for benchmarking fates. Two of those data sets are shown here. So the red dots are from Galbraith et al. So there's about 178 plots here. And for each plot, we have total above ground biomass, productivity, and carbon residence time. And then another data set is this Pipinoir et al. Paper. So there's fewer sites here. They're shown in blue, just 25, but they're large plots, typically 20 to 50 hectares, although there's a couple of smaller ones. And for this data set, we have the total above ground biomass, ground woody productivity, and above ground woody mortality for each site. But we also have those rates by size class. So that's shown here. We have diameter along the x-axis and above ground biomass, productivity, mortality. So this is a really useful data set for benchmarking a demographic model like fates. We can check that we're not just getting totals right, but we're actually getting the size distributions of these rates correct. So I started comparing fates in fixed biogeography mode with no competition. So one of the reduced complexity modes that Jackie mentioned earlier, against these data sets. So this figure is showing the plot above ground woody productivity on the X. That's from the Galbraith data set versus fates on the Y. And two things kind of immediately stand out. First of all, fates has this really high productivity bias, especially for the more tropical sites. So the colors here refer to latitude of the sites. But then there's also a bunch of sites which are failing to establish in fates. And this is despite a slightly low GPP bias. So this is an ILAM comparison of fates with the FluxCom data. So more blue colors here are a low GPP in fates. So we have high productivity despite low GPP. So that's suggesting that possibly there's some bias with the respiration scheme in fates. And I think we kind of already knew that respiration was too low in fates, but I've been trying to delve into this more and figure out kind of how we can best correct some of these biases. So in fates, we have maintenance respiration. This is leaf layer dark respiration plus sapwood and fine root maintenance respiration. And this is based on this fates base MR20 parameter. We also have growth respiration. So that's GPP take away maintenance respiration times by this growth respiration factor parameter. So I did a really simple parameter sensitivity analysis. Each panel here is again productivity in the forest inventory data versus fates. And as we go top left to bottom right, we've got increasing values of this maintenance respiration parameter. The blue box is the default parameter in fates. Red is the one that came out as best in terms of the root mean square error. So you can see as you increase maintenance respiration, as expected, productivity goes down, but we get more and more of these sites where we have a lack of establishment of the forest in fates, whereas the inventory data is telling us there should be a forest there. And if we look at the ILAM comparison, it looks like biomass kind of improves as we increase maintenance respiration, but we're seeing sort of a less good GPP, although net ecosystem exchange is starting to improve. Very similar results for the growth respiration parameter sensitivity. Again, this is productivity in the data versus fates. As you start to increase this growth respiration parameter, productivity goes down. And if you look at MPP over GPP on the right-hand side here, you can see that with the default parameter in Fates, this ratio is about 0.7 or 8 in the tropics, which is really high. We'd expect it to be more like 0.3. So we start getting closer to that expected ratio as this growth respiration parameter increases. Okay, but then we started looking into some of the leaf layer dark respiration schemes. So the default in Fates at the moment is this Ryan 1991 paper. So respiration at the canopy top at 25 degrees C is scaled by temperature and leaf nitrogen through the canopy. Charlie recently introduced the Atkin et al. Scheme. So here, respiration is scaled again by leaf nitrogen, but also by a moving window of temperature. So we have respiration acclimation with this scheme. And if you're interested, you can look at the GitHub pull request 931 or the issue 729 for more of the details and discussion about these two schemes. Okay, so I was comparing these two schemes in Fates, trying to look at sort of what the improvement might be from switching the default respiration scheme. The ILAM comparison sort of makes a strong case for the Atkins scheme. But on the right here, we have biomass for each scheme. On the top is Atkin, and you can see its biomass is generally much lower than in using the default respiration scheme, which is shown on the bottom. So that's good, I think. But then if you look at the kind of details, it's kind of patchy. There are areas where we think there should be forests where biomass looks really low. And you can see that especially clearly if you look at these blue dots. So each blue dot is a point where we have a forest plot with inventory data that's very much suggesting there's a forest. But in Fates, there's very, very low biomass in these sites, so less than 1 kilogram per meter squared. So in the Ryan scheme, there's a couple of those, there's like 5 or something, which maybe we could expect with this grid cell resolution. This is 4x5. But with the Atkins scheme, there's quite a lot of these sites where there should be forests, but there's like a lack of establishment in Fates. So I've been trying to look into the conditions for successful establishment in Fates. These are all bare ground simulations, I should say. And we're not seeing extinction of the forest, it's just it's never really starting to grow in some of these sites. So I wasn't sure whether it was that there's just growth is so slow that none of the trees are reaching reproductive size before the population declines from all these various sources of mortality, or whether there's like some initial high mortality that's just killing recruits in the first couple of years. So I tried a bunch of things, increasing initial recruit density, increasing carbon storage, starting runs in the wet season instead of in January. And I didn't really see much improvement from any of those attempts. Increasing supplemental seed rain did kind of marginally improve things, but isn't a very satisfying solution. And this is just showing some of those grid cells where we see a lack of establishment. So on the left, each panel is a grid cell where there should be a forest and there isn't. On the left, we've got carbon starvation mortality through time by size class. So it looks like in some plots, you have just like an initial pulse of really high mortality that's basically killing things before they get established. In other sites, there's kind of more of these, it's just sort of, they're persisting for a little bit of time, but with really high carbon starvation mortality that eventually leads to a decline in the population. And you can see that on the right, which is the number of plants through time for those same grid cells. Confusingly, not all of these sites are in areas with that have negative net carbon uptake. So this is net carbon uptake over all the leaf layers combined, with blue being negative, red being positive. Yellow dots now are the sites which are failing to establish. Some of them are in areas where it looks like they should be establishing. So this is a kind of confusing result that I'm still trying to understand. So at the moment, I'm kind of trying to think about whether there are thresholds in carbon balance that lead to lack of establishment. It looks like if we go back to this maintenance respiration parameter sensitivity, there's a clear threshold here where suddenly the number of sites that fail to establish increases dramatically. So I'm trying to think about how we can start diving into this, looking at the carbon balance of these plants in the initial few years and understand why in some cases they can establish and in others they can't. So with that, I'll just say networks of forest plots are providing really valuable demographic benchmarks. When we compare FATES with some of these forest inventory data, we see this very high above ground woody productivity bias, which is reduced when we increase respiration as expected, but this is leading to some sites failing to establish, and I'm still trying to explore that. So trying to find thresholds that will allow for successful establishment. And then hopefully if we can get that sorted, there's still a lot to do. As always, we would end up, if we switch to the Atkins scheme, with acclimation of respiration, but not photosynthesis. So thinking about acclimation of VC max, and then trying to explore carbon use efficiency of different vertical scalings of respiration, nitrogen and VC max through the canopy. And I think that's all I've got. Thank you.
Thanks, Jesse. That was great. I don't know who figured out to do the explosive clapping. I couldn't figure that out yesterday. Do we have any questions in the room or online? We have an online question.
Oh, it's from me.
Oh, okay, we have a question from in the room.
I'm curious how, this is from a naive, I don't know, Fates wannabe. And Jesse, I'm curious how you think about calibrating for maintenance respiration versus allocation for a problem like this where you've got high biomass and low GPP. And it sounds like also a low LAI bias from Marco's talk typically. I don't know if you can quickly provide suggestions for as a Fates developer, how you think about tackling that problem.
Yeah, that's a great question. So how do we know whether it's a respiration problem versus an allocation problem? Yeah, good question. I'm not entirely sure I have a good answer for you. I think we can start looking at some of the size distributions as well, trying to figure out if, I think just benchmarking as many outputs as possible and make sure we're not getting right answer for wrong reason. Yeah, I'd have to think about that more.
Thanks.
Do we have any other questions? Oh, Dave?
I think maybe you already said this, but with all this establishment problem, must be an option in FACE to just turn off mortality. All the mortality in
It is, and I did try that. I turned off all mortality except background mortality and termination mortality. And the results were quite confusing. Like it still looked like some of these sites were going extinct, which I'm just still trying to figure out why that's happening. Yeah.
Can I make quick comments about that?
Yeah.
I think we should probably take a look at the termination mortality because I noticed that in mine too.
Okay. Yeah.
Maybe being called to more frequently than what it should.
I don't know if people in the room could hear that, but Marcos is commenting that termination mortality is potentially being called more frequently than it should be.
Okay. Thank you, Jesse. We'll go and switch over. Okay, Rosie has a comment online. But we'll go ahead and switch over to Ryan Knox, who will talk about nutrients within FATES. And then if there's an online comment that you wanted to address.
Hello, hello? Okay. All right. Well, I timed this. I think I'm either going to be 10 minutes or 20 minutes, so keep an eye on me, please. All right, well, thank you, everybody. I'm here to represent my team in NG Tropics to talk about the nutrient dynamic model that we have in FATES. The work that we've done so far has been coupled with ELM, and up to this point, CLM has always been on the horizon, something that like, oh, we want to get to this soon. And we're at that point now, so we're actively working on the coding for getting nutrients coupled between FATES and CLM, so we're very excited about that. I'm going to bypass motivation because I think we all know how important nutrient limitations are to the terrestrial carbon cycle. So I'll just talk a little bit about the model. From 1,000 yards or 1,000 miles, the major components are that we have to acquire nutrients, mostly through the soil. Once we have the nutrients, we have to allocate them to tissues. Once they're allocated to tissues, we have to decide how that feeds back on physiological functions of the plant, such as photosynthesis, and then return it back to the decomposition cycle through litter fall. This model, at least on the FATES side, can accommodate both nitrogen and phosphorus. It can acquire nitrate, ammonium, and phosphate through the mineralized pools. Depending on what soil scheme or soil competition scheme, biogeochemical scheme we're using, it will come with its own free-living fixation package, but FATES does handle obligate, but not necessarily facultative symbiotic fixation. I'm not going to talk much about it, but if anyone's curious, feel free to ask. I'd be happy to talk about it in more detail. So about the feedbacks on physiological processes, there isn't any variability in the stoichiometry of the organs related to the nutrient cycle. We keep those fixed. So that variability is not necessarily going to be feeding back on photosynthesis. So right now our scheme does not react to at least nitrogen dynamics when it comes to regulating photosynthesis, but it does regulate respiration rates. And then, as I mentioned, N and P are passed back to the decomposition cycle. So this is another way to look at. It's like a box and wire diagram of all the mass flows in the model. At the bottom, you have your soil pools. Going up vertically, we have all the plant compartments and organs. In a FATES plant, we explicitly represent storage, reproductive pools, structure, deadwood, sapwood, fine roots, and leaves. When it is acquiring the mineralized nutrients, it goes directly into storage because we let it act as kind of this central mediator between the other organ pools, which is somewhat similar to what actually happens in nature. A lot of these mineralized pools transit through the xylem. So I think that sounds appropriate. We don't have mycorrhizal assimilation explicitly in the soil models, although I think that would be really cool. We do have reabsorption on senescence, and then these different processes at the bottom are all in the model, depending on what nutrient you're talking about. Obviously, we don't have free-living phosphorus fixation, although I guess that could be a thing, but I've never heard of it. So over the last year, we've been focusing a lot on regulating uptake. So if you look at the upper left-hand corner, we have this equation that represents the potential uptake of, in this case, ammonium in a given soil layer J. When I say potential, it's kind of like the demand or the need that the plants specify to the competition scheme in the soil. So it's the maximum you could potentially get. And that's based off of just this parameter constant that we have, which is constant for any given PFT, times the amount of fine root biomass that you have in the soil. So I think of it kind of as like an obligate uptake. There's other models out there that do more facultative uptakes where you can up and down regulate these things. But I'm making kind of a plea for a more simplified type of model before we enter into more complicated concepts like that. And then the amount of fine root biomass that we have in the soil is actually or proportional to the amount of leaf biomass that we get from allometry. And in the past, we've had this lambda term that scales between the two. In the past, it's always been constant. It's always just been a constant PFT level parameter. But what is different here is that we're allowing this to be dynamic, right? And so if your lambda is very large, you're going to have proportionally more fine root than if it's a very small parameter. And so why does this matter? I want us to look at these two different trees, and they're both essentially the same tree, except for the one on the left has a lot more fine root than the one on the right. The one on the left having a lot more fine root is going to have a higher nutrient uptake capacity, but on the other hand, it's also going to have a lot more respiration because it needs to support all those extra tissues, right? And so the idea here is that we want to find the sweet spot between these two endpoints. And that sweet spot is going to have just the amount of fine root biomass where it can meet its needs to acquire nutrients, whether it be nitrogen or phosphorus, but also has a reasonable respiration demand, and it's going to balance the carbon and nutrient. And so an analogy that I've been using a lot lately is kind of relating it to this, it's like you had like a toy where you had like this like a track with a ball on it, on this like fulcrum, right? And the objective is like, let's say your friend gives it to you and they put the ball somewhere off center, and they're like, okay, now you've got to like tip this track in order to get the ball to kind of sit on center, right? And the analogy is if, you can tip it up to get more fine root, or you can tip it down to get less fine root. And wherever the ball is on the track is kind of like your relative proportion of how much storage you have in either nutrient or carbon. And we represent that balance explicitly here with this FCN term. And by transferring it through a logarithm, we either have a positive or a negative sign there. And when we first started developing the model, we just had a linear relationship. So we said, okay, grow out your fine roots if your FCN is positive, times this like Kp constant. And what we found there was that, like you'd expect in this analogy with this ball, it has inertia. So like, you tip it down, the ball's going to just shoot past your balance point, then you're going to tip it up, it's going to shoot past again. And Charlie and I got together and we realized that, well, what would really help is if we had a derivative term in there. So if you can represent the change in this metric FCN. And then we realized, well, we're actually constructing a PID controller. So I don't know if people are interested in control theory. But essentially, we're creating a PID controller. We have a derivative term. We've got our proportion term. And then also, if we want, we can add an integral term. And the integral term is really useful for fine-tuning. If your ball in this case, or your FCN term is just a little bit off center, the integral term will slowly start pushing it back to your center point. So we need to calibrate these things, and I started running simulations at BCI, and I just did a grid search of different parameters. We started off by ignoring the integral term because we got decent results without it and just made things complicated. I did a grid search on the Kp and the Kd terms at Barrow, Colorado Island, Panama, for just a single cohort. And my objective was to see which parameter combinations minimized this FCN, got it closest to 0, and what also reduced the variance. In each of these boxes, you can see I've got a V and a B. It's just ranking the different parameter combinations. If you have a low rank, it means you're good. And we identified, well, okay, we kind of want to be, high on the Kp and somewhere in the middle to low on the Kd term. But it did.
You're at 9 minutes.
Really? Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah. So anyway, this is useful, but we decided to actually just compete the different parameters against each other in kind of like a game theory scenario where we found one that was particularly competitive against the other, and we just ran with it. So moving on to other analysis at BCI, I just want to convey that one of the most important functions of this model is to limit growth based on nitrogen availability, right? And so in this scenario, we already spun up the model. And CO2 concentrations are increasing, GPP is increasing, and then more importantly, as the plants become more and more demanding and they're being more and more productive, they're going to draw down the mineralized nutrients in the soil. And the plants in this case are responding by growing out more and more fine roots to try to acquire more from this dwindling pool. But in turn, with more root, the carbon use efficiency is decreasing. So it's limiting the growth. Another cool thing, I just think this is neat, is that we have this trait plasticity and this interesting new survival niche that is occurring. We're finding that understory plants that aren't growing rapidly don't need the nutrients, and thus they don't need the lambda term or the increased fine root in order to keep up with the growth, right? So these plants in the understory are actually better at surviving in the understory because they don't need all that fine root because they're not growing so fast. So it's kind of giving them a new niche to live in. We've been doing some comparison with data. Looking at fine root profiles has been particularly useful. The point I want to make here is that we can easily calibrate the model to fit the data. All we have to do is bump up our carbon use efficiency parameters like VC max, reduce things like respiration, and decrease our uptake efficiency, that new parameter that I was mentioning earlier. But I just want to make sure that we're making a valid comparison. In our model, we have a functional definition of fine root, whereas in the field, fine roots are defined based on what is the diameter of the fine root. And without going into too much more detail, the point I'm trying to make is that I want to make sure that we're comparing apples to apples. We have an adequate comparison. So I'll leave you here with the simplicity imperative, and I paraphrase from Prentice 2015. But our models are getting incredibly complicated, right? We have all these different modules running simultaneously, and we've got tons of parameters. So I just want to, let you know that if it doesn't look like it, we've done our best to try to minimize the number of new parameters that we're adding to the model and reducing the number of parameters that need calibration or aren't readily available from observations. So I'll just skip this one. Going into the future, there's all sorts of really interesting processes related to nutrient acquisition and dynamics that we can add. These are all super cool, and I think that they're different things that we could start investigating potentially with your help on top of this base model that we have right now. So I'll stop there. Any questions?
We've got 2 minutes for questions.
Just wondering how you rectify your statement about simplicity with your statement about all these advanced processes we should be working on.
Yeah, no. Well, I think the key is to at least have a base model, right? To at least have switches that you can turn off and on your model to make them more or less complex, right? If we're doing these large ensemble parameter calibration exercises, it's nice to have a base version of the nutrient cycling model that relies on a few parameters, but for the researcher who has a wealth of data and they want to understand how their site's working, maybe it's more interesting for them to be able to turn on, explicit mycorrhizal associations, Sam?
I think I probably misunderstood this, but it sounded like you said the nutrients don't provide a photosynthesis boost. Is that just, you mean like at the leaf level, like concentration doesn't? But like more nutrients mean you build more leaves?
No, it's just an artifact of the model. So we don't have dynamic stoichiometry in the leaves. They're really more or less fixed to the parameter that we set them at. So if you have a plant that's particularly good at acquiring nutrients and it has high concentrations, it's not going to affect the leaf concentrations of nitrogen and therefore it won't affect your photosynthesis rates.
But does it affect leaf number? Or
What's that?
Does it affect leaf number, or like how many leaves you make?
Yeah, because it affects productivity and growth.
That makes more sense.
No, go ahead and finish talking. I just want to switch over later.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Well,
I think this dynamic allocation that it seems like you get from the root allocation function is awesome. Like it provides some really interesting feedbacks. And I guess I'm curious how, like, does that feedback on the water cycle at all? Like, does the fine root allocation influence hydrology?
yeah, I've been asked that question, and it's a good question. No, right, and so right now, fine roots and the biomass of the fine roots, I see it as acting as kind of a surrogate for not just, how much fine root you have out there that can acquire nitrogen, but also activity levels. Plants can upregulate, downregulate, exude, create enzymes.
It's more like a nutrient root and a water root are separate.
Right, and so we need to start teasing these things apart so that the hydraulic scheme can also dynamically change root biomass.
Thanks, Ryan. Okay, we're going to switch over to Joshua Rady, who will be talking about forest management in Fates.
Okay, thank you guys for having me. I'm going to try to very quickly go through the.
Joshua, is it on?
Yes, it's on. Is it just positioned wrong? Move it up a little bit. Okay, can you hear me now? All right. I'm going to try to go over very quickly some of the final work from my dissertation at Virginia Tech that I completed last fall. So in the Southeast United States, wood production is a major industry, and it's one of the major wood producing regions in the world. A lot of that wood comes from loblolly pine plantations. These loblolly pine plantations have been heavily studied for 70 years. And so we know a lot about them, and they provide a useful tool for us to study management within a modeling context. So I ran CLM Fates simulations that sort of addressed 4 related questions of how future climate is going to change the productivity of loblolly plantations, how management is going to affect the yields as well, the yields of wood in those wood products, and also the effect of climate on management practices, and how both of climate and management might affect the area of plantation in the southeastern United States. So for these simulations, I simulated the entire native range plus a little bit for loblolly pine, because it's grown in some places where it wasn't historically found. And so there's like basically I'm simulating one plantation at each grid cell location. To do this, I used the loblolly PFT that I developed several years ago, along with the vegetation management module. For those of you who haven't heard about the vegetation management module, it's a module for Fates that goes beyond what the logging module can do and adds a lot of management practices. If you want to hear more about it, talk to me after the meeting. First, how is climate change going to affect the productivity of loblolly plantations? So I grew trees for the rest of the century under several different climates, under a constant climate scenario, under SSP1 RCP 2.6, and SSP5 RCP 8.5 scenarios. And then to figure out whether the effects of NPP changes would be due to climate, or meteorology, I should say, or CO2, I did these combinations that mix them up, okay, and decompose the climate forcing. So if you use constant forcing, you get constant effects, or constant growth. When you add in just the SSP5 CO2, you get this huge increase in NPP over the course of the century, where it's almost doubling. Adding the climate from SSP, SSP5, you get a decrease. So basically, all of the boost we're seeing is coming from the CO2, and the net effect of climate is actually negative for about 83%, 84% total increase. Very quickly, SSP1 growth is less because CO2 doesn't go up as high, but it still has a negative effect of climate. Then I'm going to ask how are forest management practices, how do they change wood yields with this increasing productivity, of course, through the rest of the century? And I looked at 3 different management practices: planting density, how many trees you plant, how dense they are, mid-rotation stand thinning, with or without that, and then rotation length. When do you harvest the trees? Because they're harvested in a clear cut where all the trees are harvested at the same time. And basically the baseline control is the values in underlined, and I compare that where I altered one of the other parameters, one of the other management practices independently. In brief, planting density and rotation length decreased yields a little bit, but I don't have time to really show all the plots, so I'm going to show you the big mover, which was stand thinning, which increased yields between 45 and 50%. It did this by removing more wood during the thinning process, where we remove some trees in the middle of the rotation to make room for the other trees to grow, capture some of the mortality that would occur if they had been left to grow on their own. But it also boosts the growth of the trees that remain. The trees that you harvest at the end are actually bigger and produce more wood. And there's regional patterns here, which I don't really have time to get into, but basically climate and productivity of these stands affects how much they respond to that thinning. Now, what about, those were with sort of fixed management, very artificial scenarios that were necessary to be able to compare how management is affecting these stands. But we know that managers are going to respond to climate change. So if we allow the vegetation management module to think like a forester and thins trees and harvest them at the appropriate times based on the sort of practices that foresters use, what happens? And so I ran scenarios with and without thinning where I did that and compared the rotation lengths. And all you really need to know is that the rotation lengths go down in all the scenarios. They go down more with SSP1 climate, sorry, with SSP5 than SSP1. So the more climate change you have, the shorter your rotations get, and thinning also decreases the rotation length, which is something we see in real forests. So we've increased productivity and we've increased the yields of these plantations. So that potentially feeds forward onto the area of plantations. So what I did, let's see, do I have the right? Oh, it's the old version, sorry. There's basically, I got wood demand from the LEH2 database. And I had, from the previous experiment, I had estimates of the yield and rotation lengths for each year. You can take the demand from LEH2 divided by the yield to get the plantation area for each grid location at each year. And then, but because forests take a long time to grow, you have to extrapolate back to the beginning when those trees were planted. And then you're going to have, so you can harvest from one stand in a given year, but you have to have basically other stands waiting to be ready to harvest in future years. So that total gives you at any given year the amount of plantation area you need to have growing at that time. And if you sum that up over the whole region, you'll get the total area. And this is just what the LH2 demand looks like for just the southeastern United States. So there's differences between the two scenarios. But when we look at the actual plantation area, they're actually quite similar. The decrease that we see in the SSP1 scenario is primarily due to decreasing demand. The decrease in the SSP5 scenario is due largely to increasing yields. And if we add thinning to either of those scenarios, we get decreases in the plantation area required to meet society's demand for wood products. And these are quite large differences. All of these changes from the beginning of the century to the end of the century, or with thinning, are on the order of over 10 million hectares. So not insignificant. So in conclusion, basically between CLM Fates and the vegetation management module, come up with a system that can simulate realistic forest management in the southeastern United States. Climate, in particular changing CO2, increases loblolly productivity and wood yields. And some of those management practices, specifically thinning, have as much influence or more than climate. So are probably important to represent in our models. Climate change will also affect the management cycle, so we have to think about being a little bit thoughtful about how we implement management. And increasing wood yields could decrease the area to meet societal wood demands, but I want to be very cautious in saying that. It gives you the potential for that, but there's also lots of other feedbacks. When you have land in rural areas that doesn't have a value because you don't need to grow it for something, it can lead to development. It can lead to loss of forest elsewhere because it's no longer valuable. So there's a lot of complicated things that could happen. And so there's potential for land use and land cover implications that really need to be sort of studied within the context of the scenarios that we're looking at. So there are things remaining to do Like how does management influence carbon storage, which is something that I haven't finished processing yet. Also, we don't really have the way in FATES to look at the energy exchange between forest and atmosphere and whether management affects that. And we still don't have enough information to really plan how we could use management for climate change mitigation. As you just heard, CLM FATES doesn't have nutrients, so I wasn't able to use it yet. So I wasn't able to do these experiments with nutrients, and I suspect that, especially at the end of the century, some of these productivity estimates are probably overestimates. However, at mid-century, I compared my results to, at mid-century, I compared these results to 2 other studies that were using very different modeling approaches, statistical models or lower complexity ecosystem models, and I get similar results. And then there's the question of, this is a great, fun regional experiment, but how do we actually capture management processes globally? We have data for management, like for forest area that is in management status. There's a couple different data products for that now, but those do not include the specific management practices that are used. And since those specific management practices heavily influence what comes out of those forests, we don't have the full picture. And what I've learned is that at least for a few of the really important managed species, we probably need specific PFTs, like I developed for the loblolly PFT. The original default PFT doesn't do a very good job at all even though it's supposed to, it's like there's one pine tree for the entire boreal and temperate zone. So we need a little more specificity if we want to capture some of this stuff. So with that, I want to thank a lot of people in this room have given me help. NCAR people have been really, really helpful to me and hosted me here 2 summers. And the FATES community has also been a really incredible resource. They've been really helpful in helping me develop the vegetation management module and getting these experiments done. So I really appreciate it. And with that, take questions. Yes.
Sorry.
Might be a very naive question, but because I saw you look at the emission and also climate change effect on the wood yield. What about disturbances like fire?
Fire is excluded from all my simulations. Basically, fire is excluded from the entire southeast. The native ecosystem, pine ecosystem for the sort of coastal zone of the eastern United States was a fire-dominated longleaf pine system. Those trees were basically removed from the landscape. They still exist in some very small areas. But loblolly pine, which is not fire tolerant, has been planted in a lot of those places, and there's almost 100% fire suppression. So it's more realistic probably to have fire off, even though there's probably a few fires.
Thank you.
We've got a question online. And then
Hitter asked if you could briefly explain what the results of management on yields would be for other tree species.
I don't entirely know. There's many different management practices. And the simple fact is that the different regions have very highly specialized knowledge, and it's actually very difficult to find out what management practices are when you're not working in that area. So this is an area where I think a lot of work needs to be done, where we need to bring people who are mainly gathering knowledge for their local use in their forest economic system and sort of get a database where they all contribute sort of those practice information. This is for pines, which are a fast-growing species. Other species in the region are not managed as intensively. So there are certain places where we can look at forestry and we can probably represent it in a much simpler fashion. And then there are some places where it's being managed even more intensely. And we don't have, with heavy fertilization, irrigation in a few places, trees being grown on short rotations for biomass, for example. So I can't really answer that. More work needs to be done.
while we're waiting to transition, Chris.
This is great work. I was just curious, what about the role of insect pests and pests with fungal pathogens and how those might be included in FATES?
Yes, right now we don't have any of those things, although I believe some people may be working on it. And a number of people have done insects in different ways in regular CLM in the past, and I'm not terribly familiar with that research. as a first step, what I thought about doing is basically implementing a non-mechanistic way. Basically, the vegetation management module allows you to control mortality, you basically kill things, but not, you don't always have to, it's not always being harvested, you can just leave it there. So if you want to prescriptively simulate a outbreak, you can do that with the vegetation management module. The question is, if you want to develop, something that's more mechanistic, that actually responds to climate and has to have, populations, that's going to require a lot more work. But my feeling is the first step, it would be a nice, easy first step for a student or somebody to do a comparison where they have a site that did get defoliated or whatever. Use the, prescriptively say that this many trees were killed and see what happens. Because then you can at least study the ecological response to it, even before you spend all that time developing the ecology of the actual insects. Thank you.
Thanks. Now we've got Shulin Gao, who will be talking about her incredibly important work on grass.
Well, thank you so much for introducing me. So first of all, I want to acknowledge all the collaborators on this project and also want to shout out to folks who have helped, and of course for funding resource and also computing resource. California has a diverse ecosystem, and annual grassland account for a large part of the land cover. So annual grasses have a very unique phenology that it often can finish a complete life cycle, starting from seed germination to seed production within one growing season. A study done by Xu et al. In 2004 found that the growing up and the brown down of grasses in both California annual grassland and also in the understory in oak savannas coincides with the wet and dry season in California. Grasses change from the green to a brownish look. They also change from non-flammable to flammable fields. And fire is one of the dominant disturbances in those ecosystems. Therefore, by capturing such seasonal change in matter and energy fluxes, and therefore the progressive field dynamic can be very helpful for us to reconstruct a fire regime in those ecosystems, which is also the first step towards a better projection of the future phase of those ecosystems. So one can nominate a lot of things, try to distinguish grasses from trees. One thing I want to point out is allometry. So what I'm showing here is how leaf biomass change in response to change in plant diameter for grasses, for both grasses and trees. So in the bottom left corner, I'm showing the leaf allometry for 2C3 annual grasses. And in the upper right corner, I'm showing that for the blue oak. And we can all agree that leaf allometry of blue oak is very different from leaf allometry of the 2C3 annual grasses. But how that's going to influence our model outcomes, we don't know yet. So in this project, we aim to examine model sensitivity to grass biophysical traits that will influence the phenology of the grasses, and also try to determine if we use a very different allometry setup, whether the results will be different or not. And also we try to determine the most influential parameters for grass fire. And with that, we try to generate a set of parameters that can give us a reasonable simulation of the site structure and also capturing the seasonal variation in matter and energy fluxes. And eventually, we want to run the model with the site-derived parameters and try to validate model simulation in the regional GPP, LAI, and also burn fraction in California annual grassland. So to set up the model with a different allometry, we actually did a side project. Well, we had 12 different grass species, and we collect the biomass, and we fit allometric relationship. So I'm not going to go through all the details, but one of the main conclusions we made is that basal diameter alone can be the best single predictor for allometry for leaf, stem, root biomass, as well as for canopy area and plant height. So we used data from Avena barbarata and the Brachypodium disdaction, which are two common C3 annual grasses in California, for setting up our model study. So in addition to the allometry parameters, which are training assumption parameters in the model, we also look at a list of parameters which can be grouped into 4 different categories. So first, a few parameters that we think are leaf traits and will have a direct influence on the photosynthesis, thus the growth of the PFD. And also 4 parameters that are related to the reproduction and storage allocation, which might influence how the plant compete with the other plant. And also a list of parameters that we think will control the seasonal variation of matter energy fluxes and also the mortality events. And finally, we have a list of few parameters that might have a big effect on the model simulated burn fraction. We run the model at 2 different levels. So first, at the site level, the model is run at Valley Range, which is a C3 annual grassland. And at the regional level, we run the model throughout California C3 annual grassland, which is the orange area on the map. So at the site level, first, we turn off the fire and set up the model in parallel with the 3 different allometry settings. As I mentioned before, allometry actually, there are like 20-something parameters we have to change in the model. And then for each allometry group, we changed all of them, and those parameters are kept consistent for all the ensemble members. So we consider each group as 1 trait, which is allometry trait. So within each allometry group, we turned a list of biophysical traits and hope to end up with some ensemble members that can give us a reasonable simulation of matter and energy fluxes by comparing the simulation to the observation. And with those selected parameters, we then turn on the fire and tune a list of fire parameters and try to select parameters that can give us a wide range of burn fraction that can well represent the regional observations. And with those selected parameters, we then run the model throughout the annual grassland and try to benchmark model simulation of GPP, LAI, and also burn fraction. So what we found? First of all, I want to point out that allometry is important. So what we can see here is, except for latent heat flux, we saw that GPP, LAI, AGB, and also sensible heat flux all varied between those allometry groups. And such allometry effect is especially significant for AGB and sensible heat flux. We saw that the 3 groups differ from each other. So for folks who want to get the AGB simulation correct, one thing you can consider is try to parameterize the allometry for the PFD of interest or for the region of interest. So we also found that, which is inconsistent with observational study, is that the soil water content as a trigger for drought deciduous phenology shapes the seasonal dynamic in matter and energy exchanges at a site. And this is especially true for the total latent heat flux. We can see that soil water content is the most important parameters for total latent heat flux. And for leaf area index, the most influential parameter is the specific leaf area, which is not surprising. So our model also did a decent job by capturing the seasonal dynamic of LAI when compared to site observation. And given those seasonal patterns, we can actually group our data into 3 different phenological stages. For instance, we define months from January to April as a growth stage, and months from May to August as a senescence stage, and define months from September to December as the dormancy stage. And when we group our data according to those phenology stages and try to look at the importance of parameter again, and found that it also has a seasonal pattern that really depends on the phenology of the PFD. So for instance, as a growth stage, we saw that specific leaf area is the most important parameter for LAI. And when it changes to the senescence stage, the soil water content kick into the effect. And then when it changes to dormancy stage, we saw the effect of SLA again, so which totally makes sense to me. The story is a little bit different for total latent heat flux though. So we saw that soil water content remained as the most important parameters throughout all the 3 stages, which might have something to do with the direct correlation between evapotranspiration and also the water storage. So those are the best selected parameter sets that can give us a reasonable simulation of GPP, LAI, and also energy fluxes when compared to site observation. They don't only capture the range of the value, but also the seasonal pattern. Might be a little bit off for AGV. So with those selected best parameter sets. We then run the model at the site again and turn on fire. And we found that for grass fire, the most influential parameter is actually fuel bulk density. It's a little bit different from what Jackie found in her study, but we have talked about that yesterday. It might be because she has some woody fields and I don't have that. So we run the model with the site-derived parameters throughout California C3 annual grassland and saw that phase is able to capture the regional pattern of LAI. So you can see that in the northern part of the annual grassland, where precipitation is relatively higher, we saw that both model and observation have a higher LAI. And in the south, and in the southern region, especially towards the coastal range area, precipitation is relatively low. We also saw that both model observation has a lower LAI, which is also indicated by that scatter plot on the right. But it tends to overestimate burn fraction in most regions. But one thing I think it might be due to the observation itself is heavily left skewed. So you can see that in most regions, FRAP has a burn fraction that is close to 0 or 0. And also FRAP does not really have a spatial pattern. I would say it's more like a mosaic pattern. But in phase, we have that higher burn fraction in the northern part, probably productivity is higher. And also a no burn fraction in the southern region, productivity is very low. So it's more like a fuel load limited or fuel condition limited thing. So. Oh, okay. So the take-home message is that grass allometry is important, and soil water content as a trigger for drought deciduous phenology shape the seasonal variation in water, carbon, and energy fluxes in California annual grasslands. And with the site-derived parameters, phase is able to capture the spatial pattern in LAI, but not burn fraction. So our study kind of provides a better understanding for grass PFT in phase. We all know that grasses is understudied in phase. So also, it is the first step toward understanding the fire-mediated tree-grass coexistence in California annual grassland, in California oak savannas. And that exactly points to our next step, where we're gonna bring in oak PFD into the model to try to compete with the C3 grasses and to see whether we can achieve the coexistence of the two PFDs in the oak savannas. And also want to have a future projection to see how those grassy ecosystem responds to change in climate and also fire regime. Well, thank you. With that, I'll take questions.
Thanks, that was great. Abby?
Yeah, I was wondering what this SWC fen is, and then what you said was the parameter that controlled latent heat flux in all of the seasons, but wasn't important for GPP.
Oh,
So
like this
how?
one.
Yeah. So, what is it? What does it represent? And why does it matter for latent heat flux, but not for leaf area, even in the vegetative phase?
It does have an influence on leaf area. It's just not the most influential parameter. And we all know that LAI in phase is more probably influenced by specific leaf area directly. And for latent heat flux, so I think that because there's a direct correlation between evapotranspiration and also the water storage.
But what is the term? Yeah.
Sorry, forgot to mention that. The soil water content is a volumetric soil water content. So it's like a percentage of.
Is that a parameter?
Yes. Sorry. This is like the threshold soil water content for for when the drought deciduous phenology try to start or end.
Okay.
Yeah.
Joshua?
For your fire results, it's interesting that you're getting very different patterns. Do you know whether those ignitions are from lightning or from population? Because you're working at a much lower resolution than a lot of folks. And I was just wondering if maybe population is driving those fires. So that, population is going to be similar in a lot of those areas and could drive a lot of ignitions that might need to be more randomized
you know?
We actually, for this original simulation, we actually only use lightning ignition, so it's prescribed. So we did not include like a human ignition or what. Yeah, but we might we're considering using that in for our next project. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so our next talk will be from Polly Piat. And I thought that Polly was going to be here, but I think she's remote.
I was hoping to be there, but it didn't work.
Oh.
I'm very sad that I'm not there.
Okay, sorry, Will is gonna get us set up. Well, we're sorry to not see you in person, Polly, but we're excited for your talk. Polly is going to be talking about using CLM fates in the carbon market. We can see you, Polly. We're not seeing your presentation.
Yep, getting there. Now?
Yes, we see it.
Right, awesome.
Here, wait, hold on a second. Can you try to move, we're seeing the little notice in the middle of the screen. Can you move that?
Let me get rid of it.
Okay.
Is that any better?
Can you move it down a little bit more? There, try it now. Okay, yeah, that's great.
Okay, awesome. All right, so last fall, I switched from working at UC Berkeley to working for a startup called Earthshot Labs that is in this voluntary carbon credit market. And it's been an interesting couple of months. And so I'd like to share what I'm trying to do there. So just to give a little bit of context, this graph is showing the amount of carbon credits that have entered the voluntary carbon credit market since 2010. And the blue bars are credits from nature-based solutions. And that's what this company that I'm working for is doing, trying to do reforestation projects, not afforestation, but reforestation of degraded land, and give a way for landowners to enter the carbon credit market. And I imagine you've heard some things about this market, and it's not all good. So really, we're trying to bring some integrity to this market and provide reliable carbon projections that account for natural risk and develop and help promote projects that also provide social and biodiversity co-benefits. So using CLM fates to do these carbon projections, really the first thing is needing PFTs. The projects are focused right now in the wet tropics, so not using drought deciduous, just evergreen tropical trees. And I'm coming at this from a really different perspective from what Marcos described. And I'd like to also thank Marcos and Jackie for talking through this with me earlier to, it's always so helpful to bounce ideas off of people. But I started on the ground with this project in Panama. It's in the Azuero Peninsula, and working with Cesar, who is a forester that has been working in this region for almost 10 years and has a lot of knowledge about native species restoration. They have a nursery, they collect seed from native seed, generate it, germinate it, and plant out saplings and seedlings. They're doing a lot of trials of planting mixtures, planting with yucca, a whole bunch of things. So he has really been a wealth of information. And what we did, and I had to do a lot of reading because I come from a temperate background and really didn't know anything about the tropics. And together, where we ended up, which other people have as well, is grouping this classification, grouping trees by the mature tree stature and the growth rate. So short, medium, tall trees, slow, moderate, fast growth rates. So they're planting upwards of 50 to 60 species in any given site. And so using his list and his knowledge, we populated this matrix with the species, the evergreen, just again, focusing on the evergreen species that they're using. Then I went to the database, trait databases, because of course, We need physiological trait values to parameterize PFTs. And I don't expect you to look at any one of these graphs in particular, just to say that in the process of taking all of the species that we had grouped into one of those cells and using the TRI database, and thank you, Marcos, for writing that script, for managing that database was so helpful. And also having help combing the Spanish and Portuguese language literature for additional data. Looking at what are the strategies? Do these groups of species all seem to behave the same or not? And what that showed, what I learned from doing that was, in some cases, there are really two different strategies for achieving the same niche. So for example, a short tree with moderate growth rate. And again, the details of the aren't important here. It's just that I ended up defining two PFTs because there appeared from the trait data to be different allocation or different strategies for achieving that same end growth and stature. So I ended up with 9 evergreen tropical PFTs. And allometry, of course, is very important. So taking each of the species that comprised each of those PFTs and then fitting from the Tallow database, fitting the Martinez-Cano D to H allometry, I ended up with 4 allometries, 1 for all short trees, 1 allometry for medium-sized trees, and then 2 allometries for the tall trees, 1 fast and 1 slower. So in developing these PFT definitions, allometry is now fixed for each of these 4 categories, and then drawing from distributions of all of the physiological traits that I had data for. Again, maybe I didn't say this, I selected species that had the most data across traits, so I could try to keep things, the trait relative differences between traits similar. Then started benchmarking with single PFT runs and benchmarking growth rate. So in these plots, the horizontal green lines are the bounds of observations from plantation data growth rate measurements in Panama. And the box plots are the FATES growth rates. And it's super important for these kind of projects to get the initial growth really as accurate as possible. The first 10 years of a project, the growth can make or break whether that project is viable, because investors want a return on their investment. That return needs to be large enough to cover the costs of the operating costs of the project. So I started with benchmarking the first 3 to 10 years of growth rates. And I thought I would never do this again, but I did some hand tuning after doing the ensemble selections until I got here, which I felt was, I was satisfied that the growth rates for each of these PFTs are what I was wanting them to be in defining in the first place. So then this was all single PFT. So then I threw them all together and ran ensembles of different mixtures of each of these PFTs. So there are 18 ensembles, 18 different planting mixtures, and going to benchmark biomass. I'm not going to talk too much about coexistence because I've only done a 30-year run. This is the lifespan of the carbon credit. The accreditation process only goes for 30 years. So again, this is very application-driven work. And so I'm starting here, but everything survived. Like all 9 PFTs survived in every single one of these mixtures, but it's only 30 years. So this figure is stand age planting in year 1. And the units are above ground carbon CO2 equivalent, tons of CO2 equivalent per hectare. All of these black points are observations from natural reforestation data. These red lines are plantation data, not that I hadn't used previously. And then these cyan lines are the single PFT runs. These light green lines are mixtures with more or less even mixture of PFTs. The darker green lines are mixtures that favor more of the faster growing species. This black line is an empirical model that's another methodology that we're using, fitting a Chapman-Richards growth curve to available data. And then the purple is from the Cook-Patton unaided natural regeneration with a mean and 95% confidence interval across that corridor that I showed. So there's a lot of variability in the observations and in the FATE simulations, but it's actually fairly encouraging to me that, you know, the mixtures that favor faster growing PFTs are seeming to do fairly well. This is, of course, first initial benchmarking, but it was enough that I ran then at 6 more project sites. The top row, these are projects in Kenya, or I'm sorry, in Africa, and the bottom row are 3 others in the neotropics, with green is FATES, black is the empirical, and purple is the Cook-Patton. And I just did this last week, so I haven't had time to dig into like, why do things agree here pretty well in Uganda, but in Peru, there's a really large difference between the Cook-Patton estimates and the FATES and the empirical. So it's the very beginning, and there's a lot more work to do. But we're also trying to look at risk from fire and climate change. And so again, back to the Azuero, our Panama simulations, doing 3 different runs with different temporally constant ignitions with 15, 10, and 5 ignitions per kilometer squared per year. And seeing that these are the simulations with more fast-growing PFTs. They have more carbon accumulation, more fire. A lot of work to do here, but that's the plan, is to use the fire model to assess fire risk, and then run with future climate to assess future climate and the balance between CO2 fertilization and future climate risk. So just to some conclusions and next steps, this PFT development for reforestation is really going quite well. And local knowledge was really critical to getting, you know, a starting place for what do we want to even represent. And there's obviously a lot more work to do. This was, you know, 7 sites with 30-year runs, a lot more work to do there for benchmarking. Then exploring the risks and co-benefits, still more work to do with the fire model. How do we represent human ignitions and escaping agricultural fires? Then looking to how do we use the structural diversity in FATES as a proxy for biodiversity writ large? And what can we learn about, are there temperature or soil water effects in reforestation versus running these sites with what their existing vegetation is? And we're also working towards incorporating annual plantings to offset mortality throughout the life of the project. Agroforestry is really important. A lot of these projects, while they have a core of native reforestation, they also want to do some areas of agroforestry. So can we use FATES there? And finally, working with Brian Dobbins and Will and Tegan to have cloud-based capabilities to be able to increase user access, where at the beginning of the project, we can just input coordinates, trigger some standard FATES runs, send back some useful information as sort of a scoping. Is this project looking viable or not? So thanks so much for your attention, and I'd love to take questions if there's time.
Thanks, Polly. That was great. We have a question here in the room. Daniel Kennedy?
Yeah, hi Polly, that was great. It seemed from your productivity plots from that ensemble that one of your monoculture kind of runs was maybe the most productive. How do you square that with, it seems like Cesar favors a mixture of species, and he has expert experience on that and isn't choosing a sort of monoculture, if I'm understanding it correctly.
Yeah, you're right. It was actually one of the moderate size, fast growing PFTs had the most carbon accumulation. But one of the sort of basis none of these projects are plantations. They're just they're not doing, the goal is native restoration. And so even though a plantation could maybe sequester more carbon, that's not the goal. The goal is native restoration. And, you know, that was a fast growing pioneer species. So there's nothing to say that it was going to continue like in perpetuity. That's one of the things, you know, I will be running for much longer to see, do we get to some place that actually looks like a native forest composition and size class distribution when we allow the model to run for a lot longer.
Great, thanks.
Quick question from Dave, and then we'll switch over to our next track.
I'm not sure it's quick, maybe I'll just say it and then we can have discussion next time you're in town, probably, but I'm curious what does voluntary carbon credit mean, but that's fairly easy to answer. The second is really how does Earthshot intend to use this, once you built the model up and you trust it, then how is it gonna be implemented to sort of support the carbon credit market?
Quick answer is it goes into the financial model and to determine whether a project's viable. Like for an investor to invest in a project, they want, like, the carbon goes in, CO2 equivalent goes into the financial model, and then it spits out a rate of return. And if that matches something that someone's willing to accept as a rate of return, then the project will get invested in. But yeah, love to talk about it more next time I'm there.
All right, thank you so much, Polly. We're going to switch over to another remote talk. So I don't know if Eva or Lassa will be presenting. Oh, you're together. Great. Hello.
Hi.
And so they'll be talking about infrastructure that NOR-ESM is implementing to allow more people to use FAITs. Can you go ahead and share your screen?
Yes, thank you.
Hey, so I'm gonna start. Greetings from Oslo, Norway. My name is Eva Leung, and I'm together with Lasse Ketz. We're gonna present the NOR-ESM land sites platform. Thanks first of all to the FAITs and CLM communities for discussions along the way, because this has taken quite a few years to put together. And for developing such nice models that we want more people to use. So the Land Sites Platform, or LSP for short, improves access to site-level CLM FAITs modeling. So not global or regional yet, at least, but site level. We do this with containerization with the Docker containers. And through an application programming interface, or API. We also have a graphical user interface, and all of this is described in plain language documentation and a very beginner-friendly user guide. You might wonder who it is for. The LSP is kind of the tool that at least I wish had existed when I started my PhD. And we have designed it with multiple user groups in mind. But the short answer of who it is for is kind of anyone without Cheyenne access. And it might be very suitable for students or researchers that don't have a good background in numerical modeling or geoscience. We also want to use it for students in land modeling introduction courses. And it provides a quick start on a personal computer. You don't need HPC access to run simple simulations. We have also retained flexibility for experienced modelers to use the full model capabilities. So again, anyone without HPC access can use just the containerization or kind of go behind the scenes of the graphical user interface as well. And it can be used remotely via virtual machines or HPCs. So this is the simplified overview of the software architecture, which shows a user kind of in the field on a laptop where the user can access the models on their personal computers just via a browser. So the documentation and user guide explains how it works and what to do. And the graphical user interface visualizes the model configuration and allows modeling by pushing buttons instead of typing commands to the model directly. The model output can be, and input actually, can be analyzed in Jupyter Lab or in Panoply. And this is kind of made possible with containers and API requests. So the code is openly available on GitHub, of course, where the model framework is also cloned into the containers. And the data that we have prepared for some sites is downloaded from the web, and model output is also stored locally. The software is ready, and we've written a paper to kind of as a technical description of the software, and that is in review in Global Change Biology right now. Everything is open access, the code, everything is published on GitHub, data on Zenodo. We have an MIT license, which is very open. And we have tried to make design choices that are compatible with other CLM and Fates infrastructure, which is why we wanted Docker containers as opposed to some other container solution, because Neon, I think, or some other people were using that. The notebooks we have are inspired by and also quite similar to some of the NCAR Neon tools. And the model can be updated fairly easily. And there's also potential to replace or add CSM as an alternative Earth system model to NORISM. Next is kind of small improvements, testing, getting feedback from the community. There are some planned scientific use cases. We're probably getting a couple of new PhD students that might want to use it here. And depending on demand and what resources we have available in terms of hours and competence, there's potential to add a lot of new functionalities like ensemble runs and model calibration stuff. And with that, I leave you to Lasse for a quick demonstration.
Yes, because I think it's quite abstract, and that's why we just wanted to show you what it looks like, what we've been working on. So yeah, as Eva mentioned, we have all the code on GitHub under this repository, and you can just come here and clone it to your own computer. And then I'm not sure how familiar everyone is with containers and the Docker software, but this is the only other requirement that you have to run this software, is that you also need to download Docker to your computer. And once you have that in place, then it's basically just one more command that you have to run in some terminal. And now it will start up all of the containers. And yeah, once everything is loaded, this is what it looks like. So you have an interactive map here, where we have some sites that we have collaborators in Norway who have actually collected vegetation trait data at these sites. So this is why we focused on these in the first version of the software, to integrate them directly. And you can use clickable buttons and just select the site that you want to run a simulation for. And once you do that, you can, you're probably all used to using the command line interface. So it's basically just calling the same commands, but using this graphical user interface instead. And it makes it, for beginners who do not have a lot of programming or terminal experiences, it makes it easier to just adjust the values and the inputs. So you can change the basic model settings here, and then we have different tabs for changing some subset of CLM parameters, where you can also provide additional name list parameters as you wish, as hard-coded entries basically. And you can also manipulate the history tapes like this, where you can just type in if you want additional output variables. You can just type it in here and add it to the history tapes. And also change the frequency and all these things in this interface. And then finally, what we are all interested in today is the fates part. So in the interface here, you can disable individual standard PFTs, and you can also change a subset of the parameters, mainly for educational purposes. This is how we chose these parameters that you can change here. And this is also not limited to these predefined sites that we integrate from the start, but you can also add some custom sites. For this, we provide a different tool, which is basically calling the subset data script that is also developed by people in the US. And you can basically define just coordinates using this tool, and then it creates, if you have access to the input data, which is a prerequisite for this, you can create input data for arbitrary sites, just providing the coordinates. And then the script will create a zip folder that you can then just use as input for this interface as well. And I just did a quick test run beforehand and just added a random site here in, I think it's Yukon territory. So you can just add it in here and then run cases in a similar fashion. And what we did on top is that we also, as Eva mentioned, provide some examples for how to analyze the input and output data. So also contained in this container, we have example notebooks that you can just go through, and these are semi-automized. So you can basically just adapt the case name for your own experiments, and then you can run through these scripts and automatically create some plots and for input and output, and also for comparing them to simple observations that we have from our collaborators. And okay, I think we're running out of time. So
27. So
maybe we should reserve the rest to questions, but thanks for your attention.
Thanks, that was great. How exciting. You're right on schedule. And so do we have any questions? I'm excited to try this out. Will?
This is, I guess, more of a technical question, but it seems like, at least our experience running with containers on personal machines, we tried to limit the data sets that people have to download just for speed. And I'm curious what your experience for users who want to run a generic site, if that ends up being kind of prohibitive for them to create the data set for their random generic one in a container.
Yes, this is a little bit of the bottleneck because you still need access to the atmospheric data sets, which are quite large, as you know. So yeah, the way we deal with this here is that we have some shared input data that is downloaded to the local machine, which is these global maps for some of it, which are like 10 gigabytes, I think. And yeah, then we give users the opportunity to request input data from us so that we can, if they really want to test this at different sites, we can just send the creator that is the data that is created by the subset data script to them.
Okay,
That's
so
the
you
idea.
guys generate it and then send it, provide the zip file.
Okay, we had Dave, did you have a question?
Yeah, I guess I was curious, can you control the comp set? You didn't show that, so can you change the comp set? I mean, could you run, no, okay, so it has to be fates, it's a fates comp set that comes.
In theory, you can change it, but for now, because it's just the pilot version, it's hard-coded to be a specific comp set by default.
Okay, any other questions? We're all gonna go on our break and run fates at our custom location. This was really exciting. Okay, it looks like Adriana raised her hand.
Yeah, this is really cool. Is there an option to like download the relevant, like, I guess, user NL files? Like if you go in and you make the case and like all the options that you want, I think it'd be great if you could then download all those files, and then you could kind of send that to someone and say, well, this is what I did.
Yeah. And that's basically possible because the GUI creates an API request basically, and you could just save that request and send it around and then send it and use that at different locations basically as well.
Great, that's awesome.
Okay. Thank you so much for joining. And right now we have a break, and then we'll come back at 11 for the seminar.
There's an online link for a virtual break.
And there's an online link for the virtual break. And so if you're virtual, you can join a breakout room.
Before people pack up all their stuff, or maybe you should pack up all your stuff, because more people will be joining us for the seminar. So don't have your stuff spread all over. Hopefully